All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a look at a story that's just, well, epic. The 10 Plagues of Egypt. This one has always kind of fascinated me ever since I was a kid. It's just got that, I don't know, that larger than life feel to it.
Yeah.
And we've got some great material to work with today, excerpts from the Book of Exodus, the NRE translation, and also a summary from Shabbat.org.
Yeah, it's definitely a story that's captured imaginations for centuries. And for good reason. It's not just a historical account. It grapples with some pretty profound questions about faith, about power, about divine intervention.
For sure. I mean, a river turning into blood, frogs everywhere, darkness you can actually feel. It's intense stuff. But before we get into all that, maybe we should start with some context.
Absolutely.
Can you remind us who Pharaoh was and why the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt in the first place?
Okay, so Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, he's the ruler of Egypt. And what's interesting is he's never given a personal name. I've always thought that was kind of a deliberate choice. It kind of emphasizes his role as this symbol of earthly power, almost like he's standing in opposition to God.
That makes sense. Like he represents a whole system, not just an individual.
Exactly. Now, the Israelites, they ended up in Egypt generations earlier, invited by Joseph, who had risen to a position of power in the Egyptian court. But over time, a new Pharaoh came along, one who didn't remember Joseph or what the Israelites had contributed, and he saw their growing numbers as a threat, so he enslaved them.
So these plagues, they weren't just like random punishments. They were a direct response to the Israelites' oppression.
Right, it was a showdown, really, between God, represented by Moses and Aaron,
Mhm.
and then Pharaoh, representing, well, the might of Egypt and the freedom of the Israelites. It was hanging in the balance. What's so fascinating here is that each plague, it wasn't just a display of raw power, but it was also a direct challenge to the Egyptian worldview.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, the Egyptians, they had this really complex system of gods and goddesses, many of whom were connected to the natural forces. So when the plagues start targeting those very forces,
Ugh.
it would have shaken their understanding of the world, like to its core.
Oh, wow. So it's like their gods are failing them right in front of their eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
Ugh.
And it just escalates from there. Plague number 2 is the plague of frogs.
Yeah.
You know how you mentioned earlier you were a little creeped out by frogs.
Oh, yeah.
Well, imagine the Egyptians, they actually associated frogs with Hecate. She was a goddess of fertility.
Hmm.
So suddenly, having these creatures overrunning your homes, your beds, your food, it would have been horrifying
Mm.
and deeply unsettling.
Mm.
Like their goddess had turned against them.
Definitely takes creepy to a whole new level.
Mm.
And then there's the plague of, well, it's bugs or gnats, depending on the translation. What I found interesting about this one is that the Egyptian magicians, they couldn't replicate it. The NIV text even says they acknowledged the finger of God for the first time. So do you think that's when they started to realize they were up against something truly powerful?
I think so. Up until that point, they might have been able to explain it away, or at least try to. But this one was different. It's like the first crack in their confidence, the first sign that something much bigger was at play.
Like they're in over their heads now. And this is where things get a little interesting with our sources, because the fourth plague, it's described differently in each. So Chabad.org lists it as wild animals, while the NIV describes a plague of flies.
That's right.
So what do you make of that?
It's really fascinating how these different interpretations can kind of change our understanding of the story. Some scholars think wild animals might refer to like swarms of insects or maybe dangerous creatures, while others see it as a more literal, influx of beasts. But regardless, it would have been another blow to the Egyptians, another sign that their control over the natural world was slipping away.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, on to plague number 5, pestilence. Killed off the livestock. But this time, the Israelites' animals, they were spared. So it seems like God's drawing a clear distinction here, protecting his chosen people.
You're right, it's a great observation. The plagues are becoming more targeted, more deliberate in their impact. It's a clear demonstration of God's power, both to punish and to protect.
And then we get to the boils, these painful, festering sores that covered people and animals. Even the magicians weren't immune to this one.
It's interesting to consider what that meant for them. The Egyptians were obsessed with purity, especially their priests. Imagine the humiliation and the disruption to their rituals and daily life.
Yeah, it's like God was attacking them on every level, physical, spiritual, societal.
Exactly. And it just keeps going. With the 7th plague, hail. Imagine the most devastating hailstorm you can imagine, destroying crops, shattering buildings, even killing people. But just like with the pestilence, the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived, it remained untouched.
It's like a giant neon sign flashing, "This is the God you should be paying attention to." Okay, so what comes next?
Locusts, the eighth plague. And when I say locust, I mean a swarm so dense it blocks out the sun, devouring every single plant in sight. So think about the economic and social consequences of that. Total agricultural devastation leading to famine and probably widespread chaos.
It's almost apocalyptic, isn't it?
It definitely has that feeling. And remember, each of these plagues is building on the last one, chipping away at the Egyptian sense of order and security. And then comes the darkness, not just regular nighttime darkness, but a thick, heavy darkness that you could feel.
Wait, darkness you could feel. What does that even mean?
It's a powerful image, right? It emphasizes the tangible nature of this plague. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was this oppressive presence, like being wrapped in a blanket of fear and uncertainty.
I can only imagine how terrifying that must have been, especially after everything else they'd endured.
Exactly. And even those Israelites who were living among the Egyptians, they experienced this darkness. It's a reminder that even trying to blend in, to assimilate, doesn't offer any protection when God is making a point.
Okay, so we've reached the ninth plague, and things have been, well, pretty intense so far. Where do we go from here?
Well, this is where we get to the climax of the story, the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. It really hits at the very heart of Egyptian society, striking down every firstborn child, from the pharaoh's son to the firstborn of their slaves.
Wow.
Can you imagine the grief, the anguish, sweeping through the land?
It's heartbreaking, honestly. It really makes you think about God's justice, you know? I mean, so many innocent lives were lost.
It's a complex issue. It's been debated for centuries, really. Some argue that the plagues were a necessary evil, the only way to break Pharaoh's will and secure the Israelites' freedom.
I can see that.
But others, they struggle with the idea of collective punishment, especially when it involves children.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think about those big questions. Justice, mercy, the nature of God's power.
It's one of the things that makes this story so enduring. It doesn't offer easy answers. It forces us to grapple with these difficult truths and to confront our own beliefs.
It's not just a feel-good story of liberation, is it? It's got these dark, challenging elements that really stay with you.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the death of the firstborn, it wasn't random. It was directly tied to the Israelites' Passover celebration. They were instructed to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, a sign for the angel of death to pass over their homes.
Right, and that act of marking their homes and their hasty departure with unleavened bread because they didn't have time to let it rise, we still see that commemorated today in the Passover Seder.
It's a powerful tradition, linking contemporary Jewish practice to this pivotal moment in their history. But there's another element of the story we haven't really talked about yet that always fascinates me. It's this recurring theme of Pharaoh's hardening heart.
Oh, yeah. That's a tricky one. It's mentioned throughout the plagues. So how do we interpret that? Is God directly hardening his heart, taking away his free will? Or is Pharaoh choosing to remain stubborn despite everything he's seeing?
It's a question that's puzzled scholars for generations. Some interpretations suggest that God was directly intervening, controlling Pharaoh's actions to achieve a divine purpose.
Okay.
This view really emphasizes God's sovereignty, the idea that he can use even the most powerful rulers to accomplish his will.
So it's like Pharaoh was destined to play this role no matter what.
Right. But then there's another interpretation, that God gave Pharaoh multiple opportunities to change his mind, to let the Israelites go. With each plague, Pharaoh had a choice. But his pride, his stubbornness, led him to harden his own heart.
Interesting.
This view really highlights the concept of free will and the consequences of our choices.
So maybe it wasn't God directly hardening Pharaoh's heart, but rather revealing Pharaoh's true nature through these tests.
Exactly. And that's what makes the story so profound. It raises these fundamental questions about the relationship between divine power and human agency. It's a reminder that even when faced with overwhelming force, we still have the capacity to make choices, and those choices have consequences.
I like that. You know, it's interesting to think about the 10 plagues not just as a story of liberation, but also as this kind of like theological and philosophical puzzle.
Absolutely. It's so much more than just a historical account. It's a story that grapples with big questions about the nature of God, the problem of suffering, the meaning of freedom. It challenges us to think deeply about these issues, to confront our own beliefs and assumptions.
Yeah, it really does. Okay, so we've talked about the individual plagues, but let's zoom out for a minute. What was the overall significance of the 10 plagues? What was God trying to achieve?
Well, on the surface, it's clearly a story of liberation. God intervenes to free his people from slavery, to establish a covenant with them, to set them on the path to the promised land. But I think there's more to it than that.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the way the plagues are structured. Each one targets a specific aspect of Egyptian life and belief. The Nile turning to blood, the frogs, the hail, the locusts, these were all associated with Egyptian gods.
That's right. It's like each plague is a direct challenge to a specific deity.
Exactly. It's a systematic dismantling of your pantheon, a demonstration that the God of Israel is more powerful than all their gods combined.
Wow.
It's a powerful statement about the nature of true power, about the difference between worshiping created things and worshiping the Creator.
I never thought about it that way before. It's like God is saying, look, you've put your faith in these false gods and they can't protect you. I'm the one who controls the wind, the water, the very forces of nature.
And that message, it wasn't just for the Egyptians. It was for the Israelites too. And for anyone who reads this story today, it's a reminder that true freedom comes from aligning ourselves with the source of all power, with the God who stands above and beyond the limitations of our earthly understanding.
So it's not just about physical freedom from slavery. It's about spiritual freedom from these false idols, from anything that keeps us from experiencing God's true power.
Exactly. And that kind of freedom, it requires more than just outward change. It requires an inner transformation, a willingness to confront our own fears and limitations, and to surrender to a power greater than ourselves.
So even though this story took place thousands of years ago, it still has relevance for us today. It's not just about the past, it's about our own journey toward freedom, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely. And it's a journey that's full of challenges. It requires courage, perseverance, and a willingness to confront those forces, both internal and external, that keep us enslaved.
You know, I'm starting to understand why this story has resonated with people for so long. It's not just a historical account, it's a reflection of our own struggles and aspirations. It's about the universal human desire for liberation, for meaning, for connection to something greater than ourselves.
And that desire, it's woven into the very fabric of the Passover celebration, which commemorates the Israelites' escape from Egypt. But it's not just a celebration of the past. It's also a reminder of the ongoing struggle for freedom and justice, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
So even if we're not Jewish, is there something we can learn from this story and from the Passover tradition?
I think there's a universal message here about resilience, hope, the triumph of good over evil. The Passover Seder, with its rich symbolism and traditions, offers a powerful way to engage with these themes. It's an opportunity to reflect on our own experiences of liberation, both personal and collective, and to consider how we can contribute to a more just and compassionate world.
It's like an invitation to remember that we're all on this journey together, striving for freedom, for meaning, for a world where everyone can flourish.
Exactly. And the story of the 10 plagues reminds us that even in the darkest of times, even when faced with overwhelming obstacles, hope is never lost. It's a story that calls us to action, to stand up for what's right, to fight for justice, to never give up on the pursuit of a better world. But there's one detail in the Chabad.org source we haven't touched on yet that I think is especially relevant here.
Oh, what's that?
They mention that even those Israelites who tried to assimilate with the Egyptians, they weren't spared from the plague of darkness.
Oh, wow. I hadn't really thought about that before.
It's an often overlooked detail, but I think it's incredibly significant. It suggests that true liberation requires more than just physical escape. It requires embracing our true identity, standing with our people, refusing to compromise our values, even when it's difficult or dangerous.
So it's not just about escaping oppression. It's about claiming our own agency, our own voice, our own unique place in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a message that resonates across cultures and throughout history. It's a challenge to each of us to ask ourselves, what compromises am I making in my own life that might be hindering my true liberation? What am I afraid to embrace or to stand up for?
Wow, those are some powerful questions. It makes me think about all the ways, big and small, that we can sometimes silence ourselves or shrink back from fully expressing who we are.
And the story of the 10 plagues. It reminds us that true freedom requires courage, not just to escape external oppression, but to confront those internal barriers that keep us from living authentically and fully embracing our own potential.
It really is an epic story. You
Yeah.
know, like this cosmic battle playing out on this human stage.
Yeah, it really does have that feel. And I think that's part of the reason why it just keeps resonating with us today. It taps into these deep archetypes, these universal themes of oppression, liberation, good versus evil, the struggle against those seemingly insurmountable odds.
Yeah, it's like a story that's wired into our collective consciousness. We're just drawn to these narratives of overcoming adversity, of finding hope in the midst of darkness.
Exactly. And in 10 Plagues story, it kind of takes it a step further,
Yeah.
weaving these human struggles into a larger um, spiritual narrative. It's not just about escaping physical bondage, but it's about breaking free from the limitations of our own minds, from the false idols and beliefs that keep us, well, enslaved.
Speaking of that deeper meaning, I remember you mentioned earlier that we hadn't even touched on the Passover sacrifice itself and the symbolism of the Paschal Lamb.
That's right. And it's a crucial element of the story, especially when we're thinking about its broader impact. The Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood, a sign for the angel of death to pass over their homes.
It's such a powerful image, isn't it? This idea of life being given to spare others.
Yeah, it really is. And it's a concept that it has like profound theological implications, extending far beyond the immediate context of the Exodus story. For Christians, the Paschal Lamb prefigures the sacrifice of Jesus, who is seen as the ultimate Lamb of God, atoning for the sins of, well, of all humanity.
So even though this story originated within the Jewish tradition,
Yeah.
it's had this ripple effect throughout history, shaping other faiths and influencing our understanding of sacrifice, redemption, and the nature of divine love.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that exploring a story fully, it often requires us to look beyond the surface, to consider the different perspectives and interpretations that have, well, kind of emerged over time.
So it's like adding layers of meaning, enriching our understanding, and appreciating the complexity of these ancient narratives.
Yeah, it's a journey of discovery. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. It's not about finding all the answers, but it's about engaging with the material in a thoughtful way, a nuanced way, allowing ourselves to be challenged and transformed by the encounter.
I have to say, I came into this deep dive thinking I knew the story of the 10 plagues pretty well. But you've really helped me see it in a whole new light, connecting the dots in ways I hadn't considered before.
It's a story that just keeps revealing new layers of meaning the more you engage with it. And I think that's the mark of a truly great story. It's timeless, it's universal, speaking to something deep within the human experience.
It's been so fascinating to explore the historical context, the symbolism, the ethical dilemmas, and the enduring legacy of this ancient tale. But as with any good deep dive, we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. There's always more to uncover, more to ponder, more to learn. And I'd encourage you to continue exploring this story, delving into the different interpretations, the theological debates, the connections to other faiths and traditions.
What really stands out to me is how this ancient story, it still speaks to us today. It reminds us that the struggle for freedom, for justice, for meaning, it's an ongoing journey for all of us, both individually and collectively.
Yeah, I agree. And it empowers us to recognize those false idols in our own lives, the things that keep us from fully embracing our potential and living authentically.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. What plagues are you facing in your own life? What are those obstacles that stand between you and your own liberation?
And maybe more importantly, what are the sources of hope and strength that can help you overcome them? What are the stories, the traditions, the beliefs that guide you on your journey?
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I really hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring this fascinating and complex story.
Yes, thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to diving into another fascinating topic with you next time.